All right. So, in the second chapter, I want to talk a little bit about the intervention process as an act of persuasion. Think about what we are actually trying to achieve when we do intervention, when we design intervention. And what we're trying to do is basically we're trying to change the, for instance, attitude or the expectation or the norm people have about the behavior in order to change their behavior, right? We're trying to persuade them to change them. So, you can think of many interventions as acts of persuasion. And I think it's really important to think about this and think about the situation where this act of persuasion takes place and who are the people, the players who are involved, in order to have a better understanding of how to design a really effective intervention. So, a lot of this might be familiar from what you learned last year in your social psychology module, but I would like to kind of repeat some of that stuff just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So in the beginning, I think research on persuasion had this kind of very rational, normative model of understanding how persuasion should work, right? So let's say there's this, there is this person here on the left, and let's call him the source, and what he's trying to persuade us, for instance, in a situation is about whether or not we should watch a new Netflix show. So let's say he's kind of telling us some information. Information goes into our ear. From our ear, it goes into our brain. Then we process that information, and then we change our attitude accordingly. We might think about whether he's knowledgeable about TV in general, whether we like his taste. We kind of evaluate the content of the message, and then we kind of rationally change our attitude according to these assessments. So this was kind of like a very elaborate way of thinking about persuasion, a very rational way. But I think if you kind of look at how persuasion more often than not takes place, or how it is done, then you will easily see that this is not often how it is going down. Also, it is often not how it is very effective. So for instance, look at this. Think about topics that are much hotter, that are much more fiery than a TV show you might want to watch or not. Think about climate change. Think about autism and vaccinations. Think about anything political. It's not that acts of persuasion that take place in this rational way, but rather we have kind of pre-existing beliefs that bias everything that is said, and we might not care about the quality of the evidence. For instance, in the US, there is now less and less people every year think that climate change is man-made, even though the scientists, credible sources, have gathering more and more evidence and become more and more convinced that climate change is man-made and that we have to do something in order to stop our planet from dying. Yet people become less persuaded. How can that be? Or ad companies, right? Their acts of persuasion often don't involve any type of message. It's simply an attractive person here, George Clooney, drinking coffee, and next to it, the name of the brand. So there's not even anything to analyze here. Right? They're not even trying to engage your rational mind. We don't even know if George Clooney is a credible source or not about drinking coffee. I don't know, at least. And there's no information to be processed. But yet we know that this is an influential way in persuading people to buy this cafe. How can that be? So in order to kind of explain this evidence, there are different ways that people are persuaded to change their beliefs, their attitudes, and their norms. Cacioppo and Petty have developed this elaboration likelihood model of persuasion. I really hope that this is by now already familiar with you from last year. Very influential model in social psychology, but in psychology in general, right? And what they say is like, okay, there's a persuasive message coming in, and sometimes the central route is activated, and sometimes the peripheral route. So the central route is this kind of normative thing. There's like an audience who wants to really intelligently analyze a message, right? And then the way it does, it's like a lot of processing and effort is involved in evaluating the message. And based on this motivated evaluation process, there will be a lasting change here, for instance, in attitude. And this is when the persuasion happens. But there's also a different route. Maybe people are not really interested in that moment to analyze the data, analyze what has been said, analyze the message. Rather, they rely on kind of cues outside of the message, right? Think about George Clooney drinking the coffee, and this might not change their attitude for long, but it still changes the attitude, and sometimes in really important and powerful ways. So there are these two different routes. Let me illustrate that a little bit more because it's so important by telling you about an experiment I did with Tali Sharot, who is at UCL. So what happened is, imagine I invited you to participate in an experiment that you would meet me in the beginning. I was like, oh, actually, we're interested in how people, with the help of others, evaluate real estate items. And here's another participant, and you would meet this another participant, you would chat a little bit with him or her, and then each of you would go into different rooms. And in these rooms, you would play a real estate game. And you would play both the same game. And for instance, here, you would see a real estate item, like a house. And then you have to say, like, what do you think the real price, the real listing price of this, is it higher or lower than the displayed price? So here you might think like, oh, it looks really nice. Location looks great. There's a little bit of ocean there. I think it's definitely higher. Okay. So your judgment would be higher, and then you can invest some of your money. Okay, this is important. This is basically an indicator of your confidence, but you can invest some of your money, and then you learn what your partner did. So sometimes your partner would agree, and sometimes on other trials, your partner would disagree. You would see about, I think, 175 different properties. So sometimes your partner would agree and sometimes your partner would not disagree. And then you would see how confident he or she is in their guess. And finally, I would give you another chance to change your investment. So imagine you said higher, this person said also higher. Okay, so now you see that they were betting 50 and you think like, maybe I should increase mine to 45. So I can now measure the quantitative difference between these two and say like, okay, this indicates me how influenced you were on this trial. I hope this makes sense. This is basically your change in wager that gives me a feeling for how influential on that trial your partner was. So now let's look at the results. Here you see conforming opinion, which means both partners agreed. Here's disconforming opinion, both partners disagreed. On some trials, we didn't really provide any information. We just like, oh, on this trial, you don't see what your partner is doing. So you would just see X's. And this was basically just to see if you have a natural tendency to go up or down. And here you see this change on wager on the Y-axis. Now, if you look at the data, then you can see that if no opinion provided, you would not have done anything, right? You would just change the way you were. So you can see the NS, it's not different from 0 here. Basically, people do not change their mind if they don't see any information. That makes a lot of sense. So what do they do if the both of them agree, right? So here you can see that they change their wager a lot by around 7%. So this is significantly from 0, which also tells us that the partner at least in some cases, the participants thought like, oh wow, the opinion that the partner provided was really valuable and led me to change my guess. So interestingly for us, what happens if the people disagree? And here you can see that they went down a little bit, which was also significantly from 0, but way less. So if you see this, it's about 7, and here you can see it's about 3.5. So a disagreeing partner was way less influential. Interestingly, in our data, and we replicated that finding several times, we don't really see a difference between these two conditions. So providing no information and providing providing no information or providing information from a disagreeing partner had the same influence, barely any, on people's opinion, while the same partner, when they agreed, had a really strong impact on them. So what does that tell us? It tells us basically that there's a cue people take whether or not they should process the subsequent information. Interestingly, we did a study while both of these people were in a scanner. So if you would have participated in a scan in the study, you would have done this game playing in a scanner. There would be a glass wall here, and on the other side, your partner would be in the scanner, and you would do the same thing. So it was a really nice setup. And what we can see basically with the scanner is we can track the blood flow in the brain, telling us a little bit about which brain regions are involved and how information is tracked. So if there was agreement, if you and I agreed, for instance, if we would both be participants in a study, what we can see is that subsequently the information is carefully tracked, okay? So people looked at how much the other person invested, they analyzed it, and then they changed their wager accordingly. And that's somehow similar to the central route, right? The careful procession of information. But what happened if the partner disagreed? What we can see thereafter is that just after the sign, after the cue that the partner disagreed, the same regions, there's nothing happening here. These regions are supposed to indicate my likelihood of being wrong or right. And you can see that if we both disagree, my brain basically just shuts down and avoids any information subsequently that is provided by you. So you can think about these as these two different routes, right? In one route, in the central route here, there's like, I have this cue, okay, to activate kind of like the careful processing of the partner's wager. My brain is tracking this information, and this tracking then leads me to change my final wager. Whereas when you disagree with me, I simply shut down. I take the disagreement as a cue that now your information is not valuable. I don't track your wager. I do nothing in my brain happens, and hence I just neglect the information that you provided. So here in this case, the difference is basically whether we agree or disagree, whether there's a route taken to the left, the central route, or a route taken which is more peripheral. And so this is just one cue that instigates how the information is processed. So what does that tell us for intervention? In some ways it tells us, and we come back to that it matters from whom the information comes and what type of information we provide. So we have to, if we want to kind of get long-lasting change, if we try to use that with a persuasion, we have to use somehow get the audience motivated to process that information in a way that leads to lasting change. Or we might not feel like that we can motivate them, and then we have to think about how can we use the peripheral effectively in order to change people's opinion. And this is what the next chapter is about. How can we use these different routes in order to change into what do we know about the effectiveness of these different components of this process in order to make someone or something more persuasive.